While bar graphs are able to compare several quantities by differing the heights of the bars, you have to be careful that you are not also increasing the width. See, in a bar graph, the area has to vary in that proportion to the height, otherwise our eyes are not going to receive the right impression. So your bars must be equally wide in order for your data to be presented correctly. However, these bar graphs can be a little boring with the rectangles. And so you will often see creative pictures such as this one where the Dyson vacuum cleaner is being compared to the other types of vacuum cleaners in this graph. But the problem is the Dyson vacuum cleaner there on the right looks so much larger than the other values. Now, yes, it is supposed to be higher, but because the height and the width were increased, it makes it look really about 16 times as large as the smaller vacuum cleaner because of that, when really it should only be about 4 times as large. So be careful when you're looking at or creating a bar graph and you're tempted to use these pictograms. They look really cool, but it's very difficult for you to be able to create a not misleading graph. Another popular type of graph is what's called a line graph. And we use these line graphs to look at how a variable changes over time. But I want you to take a look at this graph that was displayed in, I believe, a newspaper article. It might have been online, but this came out in 2014. You see, in Florida in 2005, they enacted the Stand Your Ground law. And what that law told us, or allowed for, was that if somebody were to break into your home, you were allowed to defend yourself and even shoot and kill somebody if they were on your property and not be held liable and not be able to be prosecuted for that. So if you take a look at this graph, the impression that you get is that after Florida enacted this Stand Your Ground law, that the number of murders committing firearms went down. And so with just a quick glance, it makes it look like this Stand Your Ground law might have influenced the number of firearm murders and made it go down. But I want you to look at something that was interesting in this graph. Notice that 0 is up at the top and 800 is at the bottom. The scale, or the axis here, was flipped. And the consequence of that is now any decrease is actually an increase. Now it turns out the artist who created this was trying to make an artistic statement, but the effect of that was to actually completely mislead people from interpreting this graph correctly if they weren't paying attention. So anytime that you see an increase, it's actually a decrease, and anytime you see a decrease, it's actually an increase from what the data actually said. So these artistic decisions that are made can have a big impact in the conclusion that people draw. But that was an example of a misleading line graph where you are looking at how these quantitative variables are changing over time, whether it's the number of murders committed using firearms or things like how the economy is growing or how unemployment is changing over time, or anything where it's interesting to look at those changes over time. You always should put your time on the horizontal scale and the variable that you're measuring on the vertical scale. Now, make sure that 0 is at the bottom and you increase going up, otherwise it's a very misleading graph. Also, make sure that your time intervals are spaced evenly, because if you don't, then you would distort the spread of time. You can also create a line graph that's broken down according to some other categorical variable. So for example, you can look at unemployment based on the type of job or the type of education that somebody has. So if you look here from 2008 to 2018, you see that the unemployment rate was a relatively steady decrease from about 2010 until 2018. whereas from 2008 to 2010, the unemployment rate rose sharply. And if you remember, that was during the Great Recession in 2008 and 2009. And so we saw a huge jump, but we noticed that the jump was much more significant for people with less than a high school or a high school education versus people with some college or a bachelor's degree or higher. You also saw the unemployment rate drop much quicker for those first three categories, whereas the bachelor's degree or higher stayed a lot more steady and constant over time. So these line graphs can really help you visually look for an overall pattern. You're looking for an upward or a downward trend over time. So in that last example, you can see that unemployment was the highest for all education groups in that 2009-2010 timeframe. Another thing you want to look for on line graphs are any striking deviations. Are there any places that seem to be much different than what's happening in the rest of the graph? You saw a noticeable increase in 2008 and 2009, and that was from that recession economy. You start to see over time that the rates did start to decline to current levels, but you see a big dip in 2010 for people with less than a high school degree. And those are things that you would not necessarily be able to see in any other type of graph. The last thing that you should be aware of with line graphs is what's called seasonal variation. And there are some jobs that increase in certain months and decrease in other months. For example, construction has busy times and not so busy times. Agriculture would have that same type. There's certain times that the workers are harvesting, and then there's other times where there's no work. You have some jobs like lifeguards that tend to only work in the summer, and you have other types of jobs like shipping that tends to pick up in the winter months. So that seasonal variation is considered when looking at the unemployment rate because we have this regular and predictable unemployment that's happening simply because of the seasons. So when you get data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, just know that those adjustments have been made before they report to the general public.